Harvard Divinity School.
100 Years Rudolf Steiner, December 15th and 16th, 2025.
Now we will hear from Iris Hennigfeld, From Nature to Spirit, Rudolf Steiner's Impulse for a New Understanding of Goethe. Ms. Hennigfeld is currently completing her PhD at Friedrich Schiller University in Jena.
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your introduction and thank you for being here. So I need my glasses, but for reading. But can you? It's for the Zoom. These. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So today I'd like to show how Goethe's approach to the study of nature reaches a threshold where the question arises of turning consciousness away from its object and toward itself. This turning back toward self-consciousness is not explicitly articulated in Goethe's writings. It was only through Rudolf Steiner's achievement to elucidate and further develop the subtle implicit content permeating Goethe's work. Steiner made this content fruitful for his later spiritual science, or as another name for it, anthroposophy. In this talk, I will proceed in 3 steps. First, Goethe and his study of nature. Secondly, Rudolf Steiner and his approach to the spirit. And third, our own engagement as readers, moving from the content of Steiner's text toward form, in order to bring our consciousness into a higher mode of knowing and thinking. So my first point, Goethe is widely known for his poetic works, such as the dramatic tragedy Faust and numerous famous poems. Less recognized, however, is his extensive work in the natural sciences, even today, something I can attest to as a Goethe scholar. Among these writings are the Metamorphosis of Plants and, above all, the Theory of Colors, which Goethe himself regarded as his most important work. Yet, more than 2 centuries later, his scientific work continues to be underappreciated outside specialized circles. While experts in Goethe studies recognize him as both an heterodox philosopher and his science of nature as a serious alternative to modern science, the broader scholarly community continues to view his thinking, his scientific thinking, through the lens of traditional modern scientific paradigms. This tendency is illustrated by Dieter Borchmeier, a famous German scholar, who in the Neue Zürcher Allgemeine called Goethe a dilettante in natural science. He also argued that the physical aspect of Goethe's theory of colors is largely irrecoverable, a view still debated. Some recent studies even interpret Goethe's approach as a regression to a poetic or pre-modern view of nature, in a book which I had to review lately. Such interpretations as the former often fail to grasp the epistemological depth of Goethe's scientific method, particularly the active role of the perceiving consciousness in the process of cognition. This spiritual dimension, I call it now a spiritual dimension in Goethe's approach, remains a major challenge for contemporary research, as we also heard from Waldorf pedagogik. While Steiner's insights are foundational, scholarship still struggles to fully engage with Goethe's natural philosophy. However, I take a different view of Goethe's scientific work. I argue that Goethe's own approach follows a different path, a completely different path. As he writes at the beginning of his theory of color, For it is a great difference from which side one approaches a field of knowledge, through which door one enters. Quotation ends. My understanding of the epistemological and philosophical significance of his writings draws primarily on Rudolf Steiner's insights into Goethe's intellectual approach, as well as on the phenomenological method, especially developed by its founder, Edmund Husserl. These insights allow us to reconsider Goethe's, also Steiner's approach, leading from nature to spirit as elaborated in Rudolf Steiner's studies on Goethe. Now I come to my second point. The young Rudolf Steiner, as you know, edited and commented on Goethe's scientific writings for the Deutsche Nationalliteratur series, and his work spanned several volumes and focused on Goethe's studies of metamorphosis, natural philosophy, and theory of colors. During the same period, Steiner contributed, so it was in the 1890s, to the prestigious Weimar Sophienausgabe and published his own works, including Foundations of an Epistemology of Goethe's Worldview, 1886, and Goethe's Worldview, 1897, marking the culmination of his editorial phase. I'm not sure if I translated the titles now correctly into English, but Steiner's introductions and commentaries emphasized the spiritual ideas in Goethe's scientific thinking rather than philological details, a focus that drew criticism then and still sparks debate today. Throughout his life, Steiner engaged deeply with Goethe's intellectual spirit, analyzing works such as Faust, the fairy tale, das Märchen, and especially, again, the scientific writings, where this radical mode of thinking is most evident. Steiner highlighted the productive, dynamic dimension of Goethe's thought, which, in a metamorphic way, a transformed way, underpinned his own development of anthroposophy. So what was it that Rudolf Steiner considered particularly remarkable in Goethe's way of thinking? Importantly, as has been mentioned before, Steiner observed early on in an article entitled Goethe's Right in Natural Science Rescue from 1884, that Goethe's mind was not merely receptive or abstracting, rather it operated in a productive manner. Steiner writes in this article that Goethe sought, now in his words, the core of reality accessible only to the spirit. The inner essence of it, which we must presuppose if it is to be understandable. Grasping this essence requires the productivity of the spirit. Quote ends. Goethe trains consciousness to engage with sensory phenomena in a way that follows them precisely, while moving beyond them, without becoming abstract. So he begins with the raw phenomena, the common fact, we would say, and concludes with the pure phenomenon, the idea itself, as explained in his essay, The Pure Phenomenon. This distinction is crucial for understanding how Goethe's approach opens a path to a science that unites nature and spirit. Unlike traditional empirical methods, Goethe emphasized cultivating new organs. So I'm not anti-science, I'm a phenomenologist, but here's a completely different approach in my opinion. In a letter to Friedrich Schiller on theory of colors, Goethe admits, I quote, brought no organ for treating the subject, and that it must always be formed in and through the experience itself, quote ends. Thus, the scientist must undergo a metamorphosis of consciousness itself to engage fully with nature. Goethe called this method first the genetic method, genetische Methode, in 1798, and later exact sensorial imagination, exakte sinnliche Fantasie, 1824. Unlike traditional science, which abstracts laws from empirical data, so I call it roughly inductivism, Goethe's approach requires a full metamorphosis of consciousness, a point Steiner saw as foundational for developing a science of the spirit. As Steiner himself puts it in the foreword to the 1980 new edition of Goethe's Theory of Knowledge, Goethe's epistemology, I quote, Steiner speaks of a nature of knowing that paves the way from the sensory world to the spiritual one. This uncovering thereby epistemological underpins the transition from the science of nature to the science of spirit or anthroposophy. So the question then arises, how is the science of the spirit possible? Reflecting on this in 1925 in his autobiography, The Course of My Life, Rudolf Steiner emphasized that Goethe marked a summit but not a new beginning. He explained that advancing beyond Goethe requires returning to, as Steiner said, more original sources of spiritual experience. This suggests that the source of Goethe's writings finds its full expression only retrospectively through Rudolf Steiner's Goethe research, spanning from the mid-80s, 1880s, until 1880s, until his death in 1925. This research path transcends Goethe's summit by developing a science of the spirit and points toward a future Goethe, as Steiner elucidates in a 1917 lecture in Dornach. He thus points to a fundamental shift in consciousness that is necessary to truly grasp and advance Goethe's work in its esoteric depth. In more scientific and epistemological terms, this could be described as a paradigm shift. So how much time do I have? I looked into 8 minutes, okay, I'm good. When Goethe's exact sensorial fantasy is further developed into realms beyond the sensory, Rudolf Steiner in a 1922 article speaks of fully conscious imagination, vollbewusste Imagination, describing it as a future task for Western humanity, Zukunftsaufgabe für die abendländische Menschheit. What is essential here is that consciousness not only focuses on the content of its thinking or of its imaginations, on what it thinks or perceives, but also observes itself in its own activity. That is, in the act of producing these images. This self-observation becomes the crucial precondition, as Rudolf Steiner emphasized in The Philosophy of Freedom, 1894, without insight into the soul's thinking activity, the concept of knowing something is not possible. This underscores, quotation ends, this underscores that self-observation of the act of thinking becomes the precondition for genuine knowledge. This procedure may be seen as a form of inner training, a cultivation of new cognitive or spiritual organs of perception. And given the challenge of such inner self-observation and the cultivation of new organs of consciousness, Steiner characterizes Goethe in essence as a spirit of the future. Thus, we might also conclude that Goetheanism itself remains still a future event, something that still lies ahead of us. In Steiner's perspective, the full realization of Goethe's impulse awaits its true fulfillment in the future. The task of developing the organs of conscious imagination is not only an individual challenge, but also, I would say, collective or cultural one. In this sense, Goetheanism is not a completed tradition, but an ongoing and future-oriented process calling us to participate in its becoming. Now I come to my last point, the role of the reader. So finally, we must also consider our role as readers of Steiner's work and as participants. Steiner stressed in various contexts of his work that the anthroposophical book must be read differently, completely differently than an ordinary book. Our situation as readers is fundamentally different from Rudolf Steiner's own experience of the spiritual world. Yet, paradoxically, the ability to read and understand correctly only develops in the act of thinking while reading the text. So this is my argument for this special hermeneutical process in anthroposophy. Here, I present my thesis. The point of departure for us is not nature or simply spirit, but Steiner's text, first Steiner's text themselves, in which the spirit's activity, in my view, is condensed and made accessible to us. These are the primary sources for us. Engaging with these texts requires moving from content to form, observing, so this is my phenomenological perspective, observing not what is written, content-oriented, but how the ideas are structured and generated. By actively following this method, we bring our consciousness into motion, cultivating the very first precondition or capacity for higher understanding. As Rudolf Steiner writes in Letters to the Members in Briefe an die Mitglieder, 1924, anthroposophy only becomes alive when the seeking soul or seeking heart turns to the anthroposophical book. He writes, anthroposophy must arise anew each time the human heart turns to the book to learn from her. Quote ends. So the book is closed, no anthroposophy. But he says this. So what is necessary to read the living spirit out of the dead letter? How can this happen here? Rudolf Steiner writes, it is necessary that, I quote, the soul of the reader seeking the spiritual can experience as a re-arising of the spirit from the word. Only books that become alive in the reading person are anthroposophical books. Quote end. Reading an anthroposophical book requires a certain productivity of the soul, one that is also essential for connecting with the spiritual world. As Steiner emphasizes, a person can demand no other knowledge than that which they themselves produce, quote ends. But it's far from constructivism. So books contain thoughts, just as Goethe could only discover the metamorphosis of plants through a novel inner recreation, not through traditional inherited methods and concepts. Rudolf Steiner demands in the outline of an epistemology implicit in the Goethean worldview. I must work through the thought, recreate its content, live through it inwardly down to its smallest parts, if it is to have any meaning for me at all. Quote ends. 1 minute. So at this stage, there is a kind, in my argument, there is a kind of renunciation, a sacrifice of the everyday consciousness or even the everyday self. Rudolf Steiner speaks of humility in a lecture to members in 1916, which lies in not wanting to understand until one has first created the possibilities for understanding. And the very first precondition lies, in my view, in the sacrifice of the everyday consciousness. So Edmund Husserl calls this, the founder of phenomenology, the bracketing of the natural attitude. It has to completely be bracketed in order to grasp the things themselves. So this could be called the liminal experience of reading and understanding, which opens a first encounter with the spirit. So thank you. But as a final thought, I'd like to close with a quotation from one of Rudolf Steiner's lecture notes. Some wording may be inexact, as we know, in this lecture courses, but the spirit of it remains powerful. After everything discussed in his other writings and developed throughout this talk, the spirit of the wording appears to me here in an authentic way. So he said, the human being must learn to forget everything, to disregard everything that outwardly affects the senses, without, however, remaining an empty vessel. This is possible if one immerses oneself in a pure, sense-free content of thought, as it is contained in the communications of the spiritual teacher, researcher, and meditates on what unfolds. In my writings, I have followed this path. I have written them down so that, as in a living being, one part grows out of another. One thought emerges organically from another. One surrenders oneself selflessly to the thought. An inner separation occurs. Whoever wishes to ascend higher must read spiritual scientific communications in this way.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, Preston Fellows of Harvard College.